My name is Krista, and by the time I hit 30, I had learned one thing about my family. Kindness only mattered when it made my sister look good. Her promotion party at my mother's house was just another stage for her. I showed up late in my work clothes, carrying 2 bags of takeout because I knew there was not much in my mother's fridge. As soon as I stepped into the kitchen, eyes dropped to the bags in my hands. My sister stood by the counter with a glass of wine, like she owned the room. She glanced at the food, then at me, and a sharp smile moved across her face. "You're less useful than a homeless person," she said. "At least they know they're pathetic." Laughter cracked through the room. My mother covered her mouth like she was embarrassed, but she did not tell my sister to stop. A fork clinked against a plate in the next room. Then even that small sound went quiet. Heat moved up my neck, but I did not defend myself. I did not remind them who brought over groceries when money was tight, or who had spent years quietly fixing their problems. I set the bags on the counter, said a calm, "You're welcome," and walked out without taking off my coat. 2 weeks later, the version of my sister from that celebration was gone, and the life she had been so proud to show off was coming apart. Before I tell you what she said next, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I am curious to see how far this story will travel. The next morning, the light coming through my blinds felt harsher than usual. I lay there for a while, shoes still by the door, coat still hanging where I had dropped it the night before. My phone sat on the nightstand, face down, vibrating every few minutes until the battery warning finally cut through the quiet of my apartment. When I turned it over, the screen was full of messages. My mother, Sandra, had sent a short line about how I should not take things so seriously. My father, Todd, had added a thumbs up to her text, as if that somehow counted as support. There was a group thread full of pictures from the celebration. My sister, Valerie, grinning beside a grocery store cake, one hand lifted in a mock toast to her new era. My niece, Cassidy, wedged into her side with a strained half smile that did not reach her eyes. I scrolled through them slowly. No one asked whether I made it home safely. No one mentioned the food I had carried in, or the fact that I had left without a plate. It was as if I had existed last night only as a prop, a pair of hands delivering dinner so Valerie could bask under better lighting. The more I looked at the photos, the more staged the entire evening felt, like she was pressing on a bruise just to see how deep it went. I tossed the phone onto the bed and went to make coffee. The kettle took forever to boil, or maybe my thoughts just moved too fast for it. Life did not pause because my family had reminded me where I stood. My rent was still due, my deadlines were still waiting, and the clients whose files sat in my bag still needed answers. I had built a world outside that house, one spreadsheet, one late-night email at a time, and it did not care whether my sister believed I was useful. By mid-morning, I was at my desk in the small office where I worked, a converted storefront tucked between a laundromat and a tax service. We helped people keep their housing when paperwork or payments threatened to push them out. It was not glamorous, and no one threw parties when we kept a roof over someone's head, but it mattered to me in a way my family never understood. Valerie liked titles and photos with ribbons. I liked seeing a mother sign a renewed lease without shaking. I tried to focus on the stack of files in front of me, yet my mind kept drifting back to the contrast between my job and my sister's new position. Her promotion had put her in charge of a program that touched the same neighborhoods I spent my days in. She had bragged for weeks about being the face of a community partnership, but she never asked how any of it worked on the ground. For her, it was another bullet point on a resume, another reason for our mother to brag in the church lobby. It would have been easier to tell myself that last night was just one more small humiliation in a long line of them, that Valerie's words were just noise. I tried to file the memory away with all the others, the scholarship dinner where she accepted an award, without mentioning that the essay had been edited on my laptop. The time our parents paid off her credit card debt and called it support, then lectured me about saving when I bought a secondhand car in cash. I could feel myself slipping back into that old role, the one where I swallowed everything and kept showing up anyway. A soft chime broke through my thoughts. A new email slid into my inbox, flagged as important. The sender's name was unfamiliar, but the subject line was not. It mentioned the same program Valerie now ran, and beneath that, the words documentation review and prior contracts. For a moment, I just stared at it, hand hovering over the trackpad, a thin current of unease starting at the base of my spine. I told myself it was probably nothing more than routine paperwork, just another request in a week full of them. Still, my hand did not move right away. The cursor blinked over the unopened message while the office hummed faintly around me, printers whirring and a distant dryer thumping through the shared wall. Outside, buses came and went on their regular routes, carrying people who would never know my name and would never see the way my shoulders tightened at one short subject line on a weekday morning. By Saturday afternoon, I had run out of excuses not to open that email. All morning, I circled it, clearing small tasks. The subject line stayed at the top of my inbox while I shuffled papers I already knew by heart. Each time my eyes passed over it, a slow pressure tightened behind them. Eventually, I closed my office door, sat down at my desk, and clicked. The sender introduced herself as a program coordinator named Carmen Hill. Her message was brief and precise. Her team was reviewing a housing initiative that had later been folded into a wider partnership. In the early days of that initiative, our office had helped tenants complete the required forms. My name appeared on several of those files. Carmen asked whether I still had copies of specific agreements and emails. There were gaps in the records she had received and dates that did not match the signatures. The neutral wording carried its own warning. Reviews like this did not appear by accident. Someone had decided the details mattered enough to pull old paperwork out of storage. I wrote back that I kept thorough files and would check both our cabinets and the external drive we used for closed cases. After a moment's hesitation, I added my cell number. If she was working on a weekend, she probably did not want to wait days for a simple confirmation. When I hit send, the room felt smaller. The program she mentioned was the same one my sister Valerie had turned into a personal success story, the one she said she had rescued and streamlined. Carmen's email suggested that part of that polished narrative might look different under a harsher light. I went into the file room, a narrow space with metal cabinets and a humming overhead fixture. Boxes from 2 summers ago lined the bottom shelf. I dragged 2 of them to the floor and sat on the thin carpet, moving through folders until dust settled into the creases of my fingers. Names I recognized passed under my hands. Families who had brought in eviction notices and pay stubs, trying to understand forms written in a language that felt designed to keep them out. Each folder held a trail of decisions, emails printed out, notes in my handwriting, copies of agreements with the program logo stamped at the top. Near the bottom of the second box, I found the batch Carmen had listed. Intake forms stapled to agreements. Signatures in blue and black ink. Dates, case numbers, approval codes. On several pages, someone from the agency side had added comments in tighter script, urging faster processing so targets could be hit before the quarter closed. Back at my desk, I spread the stack across the surface. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. The tenants had been approved, payments had gone through. The more closely I read, the more small details caught my attention. A reference number that did not match our database. A packet missing a standard page. A note about a landlord receiving confirmation before a tenant had actually signed. It would have been easy to shrug and call it office noise. Programs tied to public funds, though, did not leave much room for sloppy once auditors started asking how and when decisions were made. My phone buzzed against the desk. An unfamiliar number lit up the screen. I almost let it ring out. Then I answered. Carmen's voice sounded like her email read, steady, measured, with a patience that did not quite hide the urgency underneath. She thanked me for responding and asked what our office had handled and what had arrived already filled out. As we spoke, I moved through the agreements while she described the gaps her team kept finding. Files mentioned in summaries that no one could locate. Payments that appeared in one ledger and not another. Adjustments made after the fact with no explanation in the notes. She never used dramatic words. The pattern was enough. By the time we ended the call, I had agreed to scan and send her everything tied to that first group of tenants. I set my phone down and looked at the papers across my desk. Whatever was happening around that partnership had started long before my sister's party, and sitting in that small office with old signatures spread out in front of me, I knew looking away would not keep me out of it. On Monday, the office felt different before I even unlocked the door. I turned the key, woke up the machines that had rested all the weekend, and sat at my desk with a knot forming behind my eyes. My inbox had grown since Saturday, but the message from Carmen sat near the top, flagged and waiting. She thanked me for the scans I had sent and said her team had gone through them line by line. There were more questions now, not fewer. A few minutes after I answered, she suggested a video call, so we would not have to trade careful emails every time a new inconsistency appeared. When her face came up on my screen, she looked exactly how she had sounded, organized and alert. Behind her was a plain wall and a corkboard of notes, the background of someone who rarely lost track of anything. She shared her screen and pulled up a spreadsheet that labeled each case by date, address, and funding source. Some rows were highlighted in pale yellow. Those were tied to our office. Others were marked in darker shades, indicating later phases of the program after it had been folded into a wider partnership. At first, it was just numbers. Then she overlaid another document, an internal summary praising a turnaround in efficiency after a new manager took over. The language matched phrases I had heard at my mother's house about cutting through red tape and hitting goals ahead of schedule. I did not have to see the name to know who that summary was talking about. Carmen zoomed in on a cluster of entries. The dates on our original agreements lined up with when tenants received help, but the internal reporting showed a different timeline. Some approvals appeared to have been counted twice, first under the pilot project, and then again under the larger partnership. In other cases, the support had gone to landlords with fewer checks than the guidelines required. She noted that sometimes people made mistakes when a program moved between departments. Data could be imported incorrectly. Fields might not match. None of that would explain why notes in the margins urged staff to move certain files faster, or why those same files later appeared in presentations about record-breaking performance. As we spoke, a second name appeared in the corner of the call. A project manager named Brett joined from a different office. He handled contracts for the partner organization that had supplied part of the funding, where Carmen's questions focused on process. His focused on outcomes. He wanted to understand why payments listed as tenant assistance had in some instances gone straight to property owners with histories of late repairs and complaints. I listened while they compared what my records showed with what their systems displayed. Their tone stayed professional, but the gaps did not shrink as they talked. They widened into something harder to ignore. My role was simple: confirm what our office had done and when. We had received applications, checked documentation, and forwarded complete packets according to the written rules. We had not altered dates or reclassified anything. Once the approvals left our hands, they moved into an environment I could only see through the trail on Carmen's screen. At one point, Brett pulled up a slide deck from a public presentation the agency had given earlier that year. Photographs of families appeared next to tall bars on a chart, with captions about doubling impact in under 12 months. In the corner, small print credited the leadership of a new director overseeing the partnership. I recognized Valerie's title even before I saw it fully. There was no accusation in the way Carmen and Brett walked through the material, yet the implication settled on its own. The success story my sister had wrapped herself in depended on numbers that did not withstand close attention. Behind every extra percentage point, there was a real person whose case might have been counted in ways they never agreed to. When the call ended, we agreed that I would assemble a complete packet of everything our office had ever touched for that program. Copies of emails, intake notes, signed pages, timestamps from our system. Carmen would cross-check them with what her team had and let me know if more discrepancies surfaced. After I closed the laptop, the office felt smaller. My desk was covered in stacks of paper that no longer felt like routine casework. I gathered the first stack into a neat pile and reached for an empty folder, knowing that whatever this turned into, my part would be to make sure the story in those forms could not be rewritten without the facts. 2 days later, a calendar alert appeared at the top of my screen just after lunch. The agency's internal review unit had scheduled a joint meeting about the housing partnership and marked my attendance as required. I closed our front office for the afternoon, turned the sign to "Back Soon," and updated the voicemail greeting. Turning away walk-ins never felt good, but the review had moved close enough to my work that pretending it was distant was no longer honest. I slid the folder of original agreements into my bag and took the bus into the center of the city. The building in the invitation was glass, steel, and badge readers. A guard checked my ID and printed a visitor sticker that curled at the edges. Upstairs, a receptionist from the review unit led me into a conference room with a long table and a screen at one end. Carmen sat near the middle with her notebook already open. A woman from the review unit had a folder of printed emails in front of her. Brett took a seat across from them with a slim stack of documents. A fourth reviewer joined by video on the screen, their face framed by the agency logo. After a short introduction, they asked me to place my folder on the table. The review officer said they wanted to confirm how the pilot phase of the program had operated before they moved deeper into decisions made later. We started with that. I described how our office had received applications, checked eligibility, and forwarded complete packets. Carmen compared my answers to her spreadsheet. The questions stayed narrow: dates, signatures, codes. Nothing in our part seemed to surprise them. Once they were satisfied that our work matched the written guidelines, they shifted to the documents they had collected from the agency. Internal email threads appeared on the screen. Managers discussed realigning outcomes and maximizing impact by moving certain approvals under different funding categories. The language sounded strategic, but the pattern was simple enough. The same cases helped lift more than one set of numbers. Slides from a presentation to funders followed. Bars on a chart climbed beside captions about doubling reach in under a year. A separate slide carried a congratulatory message praising decisive leadership for turning a struggling pilot into a model partnership. In the corner, a title credited a new program director with the turnaround. It was the same title my sister, Valerie, had been celebrating at my mother's house. No one around the table spoke her name. They did not have to. The review officer walked through the sequence suggested by the documents. Reclassification notes, updated charts, talking points prepared for community meetings. Brett outlined what could happen to future funding if those polished results could not be traced back to solid records. Carmen highlighted entries where the public story diverged from the dates and amounts on actual approvals. My part of the conversation narrowed to a single task. They asked which figures on those charts could be tied directly to applications our office had processed under standard rules, without double counting or creative labels. I answered by pointing to case numbers and describing the steps attached to each one. On their laptops, the information lived in columns. In my mind, it still lived in the faces of tenants who had sat in our waiting area clutching folders and overdue notices. Near the end of the meeting, the review officer summarized what would happen next. Their unit would request additional correspondence from the period when the partnership expanded and new leadership took over. Staff who had held supervisory roles would be interviewed. Any approvals linked to questionable classifications would be pulled for closer examination. Carmen might contact me again if new gaps appeared when those records arrived. They slid a short statement across the table asking me to confirm that the documents I had provided matched what our office kept on file. I read it, signed at the bottom, and dated the page. No one asked me to explain why any of the choices on the screen had been made. They only wanted the paper trail to stand on its own. When we finished, they walked me back into a hallway lined with framed photos of ribbon cuttings and oversized checks. I peeled the visitor sticker from my shirt while I waited for the elevator. Outside, the noise of buses and traffic wrapped around me as I stood on the sidewalk with the folder under my arm, aware that the confident version of my sister shown on those slides now sat under the same fluorescent light that had just turned celebration into evidence. By the end of the second week, the review was no longer just a line in my inbox. It had started to press against my family without them knowing where the pressure came from. Valerie stopped posting photos from work. The stream of curated updates went quiet. My mother, Sandra, usually quick to forward every announcement, had nothing new to send. The group thread that had been full of exclamation points slid into weather comments and recycled jokes. I did not ask what was happening. I went to the office, answered calls, and kept my eyes on the files in front of me. Carmen checked in twice by email, asking for small clarifications on case numbers and filing notes. From my side of the screen, the review still looked like paperwork. It was my father, Todd, who finally broke the surface. One evening he called while I was standing at the stove, letting his name ring longer than usual. When I picked up, he talked about traffic before circling toward what he wanted. There had been some confusion at Valerie's job. People were reading too much into minor issues. He said the review team was slowing everything down and hinted that if I had any way to clear things up, I should. He did not know what documents I had given Carmen or how detailed her timeline had become. He only knew that the story he liked telling, his eldest daughter turning a struggling project into a showcase, no longer landed the same way when coworkers mentioned a review in the same breath. Later that night, a longer message from Sandra arrived. She wrote about stress and sleepless nights. She called Valerie fragile and devoted, mentioned the extra hours her favorite child claimed to work, and wrapped it all in one request. Do whatever I could to fix this before it ruins her. None of her words mentioned the tenants whose cases sat inside those charts. Midweek, Carmen sent a short update. Her unit had finished the first phase of their review. Several of the most celebrated statistics tied to the partnership would have to be corrected. Some contracts would not be renewed. There would be consequences for staff who had approved reclassifications without enough documentation. She did not list titles, only thanked me again for keeping complete records when our office had handled its part. News reached my family from a different direction. A local outlet ran a short piece about the agency adjusting earlier claims about a housing program. The article did not accuse anyone of criminal behavior. It did, however, note that reported outcomes had been overstated and that leadership changes were likely. A photo from a community event sat beside the text. In the background, at a podium, Valerie smiled at someone out of frame. That evening, Valerie called 3 times. I let the phone ring. The calls turned into a stream of messages. She wrote that jealous people were weaponizing paperwork, that politics were involved, that the review was a witch hunt. She accused me of feeding drama by cooperating. When that failed to pull a response, she shifted tone, reminding me of childhood memories and saying family should stand together when outsiders attacked. I read each line and closed the thread without replying. Sandra followed with voice messages, her tone tipping between anger and pleading. She said Valerie had been asked to step aside while the agency sorted things out. She insisted it was temporary, then admitted she did not know whether the position would still exist by the time decisions were made. Todd said little after that first call, but his quiet carried its own weight. He had leaned on Valerie's title as proof that their parenting had worked. Now that proof sat next to a correction notice. At the office, the partnership's brochures were updated. New materials dropped the bold claims about doubling reach and focused instead on eligibility and process. Carmen sent one last note to let me know that the tenants we had helped would keep their support regardless of how the agency rewrote its public story. In my apartment, the containers I had carried to the promotion party were washed and stacked in a cabinet, the only physical trace of that night. The insult in my mother's kitchen no longer felt like the main injury. It had become the moment when one version of my role in this family ended. For years, I had absorbed every slight and kept showing up anyway. Now, all I had done was tell the truth about old files, and the story my sister lived in had shifted without me lifting anything heavier than a folder. Long after the partnership's numbers were corrected, the silence around my family stopped feeling accidental. I heard about my sister's job through a forwarded screenshot. A colleague sent me a clipped image of an internal bulletin. In the middle of routine announcements, one line said the director of the housing partnership had resigned, effective immediately. The wording was polished and vague, full of transition and organizational changes, with no hint of another role attached. That evening, my mother, Sandra, called. She said Valerie had emptied her office and dropped a box of framed certificates on the living room floor. The photos from the promotion party lay face down on the table. My mother blamed office politics, jealous coworkers, the review unit that cared more about forms than families. The story bent in every direction except toward the decisions that had led to that bulletin. I listened until her anger collapsed into long pauses. Then I told her I was sorry she was hurting and that I hoped Cassidy had somewhere calm to go when the house felt tight. I did not suggest a plan, or offer to talk to anyone, or float arguments she could use on Valerie's behalf. For once, I let the situation sit where it belonged. A few days later, Valerie sent an email instead of a message. She wrote that she had trusted staff who let her down, that everyone pushed the edges of the rules, that she was being singled out because she had become the face of the program. Between those explanations, she described walking into rooms where conversations stopped and watching friends step back, as if the safest place to be was suddenly far from her. Near the end, she turned toward me. She wrote that our parents were devastated, that Cassidy was confused, that I had always looked for flaws in whatever she did. She did not mention the sentence in my mother's kitchen. She did not mention the tenants whose cases had been counted twice. The closest she came to responsibility was a single line about misjudging how the numbers would look from the outside. I answered that night. My reply was brief. I told her that when the review unit asked what my office had done, I told the truth. I said their questions were not about our childhood, but about public funds, signatures, and people who could not afford to be turned into talking points. I added that, until she could discuss what happened without treating every fact as an attack, I would not keep acting as a buffer between her and the world she had shaped for herself. After I sent it, I set a filter so new messages from her would land in a folder I opened only when I chose. The only person I answered quickly after that was Cassidy. She started sending photos of school projects, a drawing of a dog, short videos of chalk pictures on the sidewalk outside my mother's house. In one image, she had drawn a small square house and written "safe" above the roof. When I asked where the idea came from, she said a teacher had told them good rules were like walls that kept people from being shoved out of the places they called home. On a mild Saturday, we met at a park halfway between my apartment and my mother's street. We walked the path along the fence while she talked about an art show her class was planning. She did not ask many direct questions about her mother. Children learn to read tension without names. Still, as we passed a bench facing the road, She tightened her grip on my hand and asked whether I still liked sharing food with people who needed it. I told her that I did, that one cruel comment in a crowded kitchen did not change the way I measure worth. Some lives are tracked in spreadsheets and meetings, but that does not make the person at a freeway exit less real, or the neighbor behind on rent less entitled to someone who reads the fine print carefully. I said there is nothing embarrassing about needing help. The only shame sits with people who build their confidence on pretending they never will. When I think about the promotion party now, the words themselves are not what stay with me. It is the ease of the laughter, the way a room full of adults accepted the idea that needing help made someone beneath them. My sister's fall did not come because I set out to ruin her. It came because the story she told about herself could not stand next to the records that already existed once someone finally insisted on lining them up. I have not gone back to my mother's house since the review ended. I take some of Sandra's calls when I have the energy, mostly to hear how Cassidy is doing and whether she still draws houses with thick lines around the edges. I no longer sit at tables where my value is measured by how quietly I absorb whatever someone else needs to unload. Distance has not healed anything between us, but it has made the boundaries real. I can care about them without agreeing to step back into the role they chose for me. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is not that every hateful sentence gets answered or that truth always lands where people can see it. It is that quiet choices, keeping accurate records, refusing to dress numbers up to flatter someone's ego, walking away from jokes that cut through people who are not in the room, matter more than they seem to in the moment. Integrity does not guarantee comfort or applause. It does, however, give you something solid to stand on when someone tries to convince you that you are worth less than the person they feel safe mocking. Thank you for staying with my story to the end. If any part of it made you think about the lines you draw with your own family or the quiet ways you look out for other people, I would be glad to hear it. And if you simply listened in silence, that counts too.